The Sony A7C II is likely going to be one of Sony's best performing cameras, and here's why. When the original A7C came out, it was the smaller, more compact, budget-friendly version of the extremely popular at the time A7 III. And when the upgrade to that came out, it was the A7 IV. And that was one of, if not the best-selling Sony mirrorless hybrid camera that has probably ever come out. And that makes a lot of sense because it's an extremely feature-packed camera with a very attainable price tag for both amateurs and for pros alike. One of the big things being, for pros, the dual card slots. There's a few things you have to watch out for video with that camera, but generally speaking, you really can't go wrong with an A7 IV. And now we have the A7C Mark II. It's the smaller, lighter, more budget-friendly version of the Sony A7 IV. Now, I can't say I'm a huge fan of the actual size of this body, especially with the grip there, but I get it. For traveling, for street photography, for hobbyists, having a camera with this much power in a body this size for the price it's being sold at makes a ton of sense. All of the Sony cameras that are out right now, and there's a lot of them, this is the best value hybrid one out there. And it has the latest and greatest technology in it. Now, obviously you have the Sony A7CR as well, but I think this is a better buy when it comes to price. This hasn't shed a lot of what made the Sony A7 IV great, but they does shed some of the things that makes the R5 great. This is the baby brother of the R5, in case you're wondering. This little switch is phenomenal for going between photo and video modes, and S&Q is on there as well. I didn't use the S&Q mode, but just swapping between those as fast as it does really does make this a true hybrid. It also means you can separate your settings out, so you're not accidentally getting video settings in your photos and vice versa. It's got the same 33 megapixel sensor inside there and the same Bion's XR processor as the Sony A7 IV, which means same low light abilities, same ISO performance. And when you put into crop mode, which I had assigned to the C1 custom button just here, you still get 14 megapixels. So every lens you have just becomes 1.5 times, you get 1.5 times more zoom with it, but still at 14 megapixels if you're shooting stills. I took this with me to New York City on a recent trip and paired it with the new 1635 f2.8G Master Mark II. I ended up leaving this on the camera for most of the time because when I put it into crop mode for stills, that gets me a 52mm equivalent. 35 times 1.5 is 52. There's this new grip that you can get for the A7CR and the A7C II, and it really makes the body just a little bit bigger. And without that on there, I'd say the 1635, it is probably a little bit too big, but when you have it on there, it is a very nice lens that goes well with it. There's actually a really interesting feature that you can do on this now, and the A7CR as well, where you can add video markers to stills. And I actually found this out by accident. And from what I can see as the first time, you can actually black out the areas not in the markers completely. So I added two 35:1 markers and was able to compose these stills like this. And for my video focused mind, it's a really lovely way to shoot photos, especially around New York City. The best part is that you can actually add the markers to when you're reviewing the photos inside the camera as well. So you get the same experience when you're looking back at what you shot. Also, listen to the shutter. How good does that sound? Every Sony camera actually has a slightly different shutter sound if you didn't know. This is the A7R5 for reference. Because it has the same sensor as the Sony A7 IV, you still get that 7K oversample video. It's still 10-bit 422, 4K 60 in there with a crop, which was one of my biggest dislikes about the A7 IV, but I get it for what it is. All the picture profiles, S-Log3, S-Cinetone, so you can match it with all your other Sony bodies. Same dynamic range as the Sony A7 IV, and you can add your own custom LUTs to this now, which you couldn't do in the A7 IV. This actually has better stabilization than the Sony A7 IV. The active stabilization we're talking about there, it's actually the same that is in the Sony A7CR, the same stabilization, which is worse than the Sony A7R5. It gets a bit confusing, but just know that this has better stabilization for photo and video in active stabilization mode than the A7 IV did. In fact, it's pretty impressive. Take a look at some of these clips from New York City. So if you're standing still, if you're walking, if you're vlogging, like, it's pretty stable for what it is, especially when you're shooting on the wider end of things at 16mm here. Typically with Canon, with Panasonic, when you're shooting wider, you see a little bit of wobble in the corners. You don't get that with Sony because it is that active, technically digital stabilization. You just impose that 0.1 times crop and they're able to make it look really stable now. The EVF isn't as big as the Sony A7 IVs, which is one of my biggest gripes with these compact styles of bodies. They're just not the most pleasant when it comes to the experience. I don't think people are using the EVFs hugely. They're mostly using the screens. Now, in terms of the screen, you actually get the same res screen on the A7C II as you do on the Sony A7CR. But again, that's not the same screen from the Sony A7R5. So you see why I said this keeps the A7 A7IV's features, and this didn't keep the A7R5's features. There's a whole video on that you can watch up here. But yeah, screen-wise for this, you're getting the same screen essentially as the Sony A7IV. You get all the same autofocus features, like the latest and greatest autofocus AI tech that they have, the auto reframing, focus breathing compensation. It's really just stacked with everything you could possibly want from the A7IV and more, which is like the latest and greatest stuff. I could go on and on about specs, but simply put, if you're looking for the most advanced, compact, budget-friendly Sony camera, hybrid camera that they have out right now, this is it. If you can deal with the one card slot, because that's a big thing that they did take from the A7IV, which made that camera great for pros. Not so much going to be used for pros for this, unless it's maybe like a backup secondary body or something like that. You just can't not have 2 card slots. It's just not professional, really. You're asking for trouble.